We really like to think of ourselves as these entirely rational modern beings, right? Perfectly suited for the 21st century. But what if the software running our brains was actually coded millions of years ago? Today, we're diving into this explainer to unpack the absolutely fascinating science of evolutionary psychology.
So think about this for just a second. Why on earth do we instinctively fear spiders, but not guns? I mean, if you see a spider crawling across your living room floor, your heart rate probably spikes, you jump back, you get that instant visceral sense of panic. But if you see an unpointed gun sitting on a table, or even if you're just walking right next to a busy highway full of speeding cars, you probably don't feel that same innate biological terror. Why is that? Especially when we know for a fact that in the US alone, over 20,000 people die from gun violence every single year, while deaths from spider bites are, well, incredibly rare.
Well, the answer actually lies in the massive contrast between the specific dangers that shaped us over millions of years and the brand new novelties of the modern world. See, our minds evolved primarily during the Pleistocene era. Back then, snakes and spiders were a daily, literally lethal threat to our ancestors. So, those who instinctively feared them, they survived. They passed on their genes. But guns and cars, they simply didn't exist. Our brains just haven't had the time to evolve an automatic biological fear of these modern and honestly much more deadly novelties. Basically, there is a fundamental mismatch between our evolved fear responses and the world we actually live in today.
Section 1. Stone Age Minds. Let's take a look at exactly how this mismatch shapes our daily lives.
And this mismatch doesn't just mess with our fears, it actually hijacks our desires through something called supernormal stimuli. As the psychologist Deirdre Barrett explains, a supernormal stimulus is basically an exaggerated version of something our response originally evolved for. Think about a double cheeseburger. In our ancestral environment, salt, sugar, and fat were incredibly rare, right? But they were vital nutrients necessary for survival. So when our ancestors found them, their brains rewarded them massively. Fast forward to today, and fast food engineers are exploiting those exact same ancient instincts. We crave that cheeseburger not because it's good for us right now, but because our Stone Age brains are literally screaming at us to stock up on fat and calories for a famine that, in the modern world, is never actually coming.
Section 2. Evolutionary Foundations. So, how do we actually go about studying these paradoxes?
At its core, evolutionary psychology isn't just your standard psychology. It's a theoretical approach that examines our cognition and our behavior through a modern evolutionary lens. It tries to identify human psychological adaptations by looking at the ancestral problems they originally evolved to solve. Essentially, it takes the big organizing theory of biology, which is evolution, and integrates it directly into psychology.
And you know what's crazy? This isn't exactly a new idea. Charles Darwin himself predicted this exact scientific synthesis all the way back in 1859 in his foundational text, On the Origin of Species. He actually foresaw a distant future where psychology would be understood through the gradual evolution of mental powers. He spent over a decade studying the evolutionary origins of human intellect, emotional expressions, and moral behavior, completely laying the groundwork for what we're exploring today.
Now, to truly grasp this, we need to look at the core premises anchoring the field. Evolutionary psychologists view the brain as an information processing device. Its adaptive mechanisms were shaped by both natural and sexual selection. And because evolution is a remarkably slow process, these neural mechanisms are specialized for solving the problems of humanity's deep evolutionary past, not necessarily today's problems. That means we literally operate with Stone Age minds. And perhaps most surprisingly, the vast majority of our mental processes, the complex neural mechanisms actually solving these survival problems, are completely 100% unconscious.
And this brings us to a really brilliant concept called the modularity of mind. See, evolutionary biologists easily accept that the heart evolved to pump blood and the liver evolved to detoxify poisons, right? They are physical organs designed for very specific tasks. Well, evolutionary psychology argues that our brains work the exact same way. Rather than being just one big generalized computer, the brain is made up of specialized cognitive modules. Think of them as psychological organs, if you will, that evolved to solve distinct, specific adaptive problems like detecting cheaters in a social group or avoiding incest.
Section 3. Adaptations and byproducts. Because it's definitely important to note that not everything we do is a direct evolutionary adaptation. Evolution actually produces traits in a few different ways. First up, we have direct adaptations that solve ancestral problems, like an umbilical cord or a toddler seamlessly learning to talk. Then there are exaptations, which are basically repurposed adaptations. A great example of this is how the small bones in our inner ear originally evolved from jaw bones. But importantly, we also have byproducts. These have zero ancestral function. They're just side effects. Having a belly button is a physical byproduct. Psychologically speaking, learning to read is a byproduct. We use our evolved capacities for language and vision to do it, even though our ancestors obviously didn't have books. And finally, there is just random genetic variation.
Section 4. The mismatch theory. Let's see what happens when an ancient adaptation meets a brand new environment.
To really understand this mismatch, we first have to understand our original home. This is called the environment of evolutionary adaptations, or EEA for short. Now, this isn't a specific geographical place, but rather the set of historically recurring selection pressures that formed a given adaptation. For us humans, this heavily points back to the Pleistocene era, which only ended about 12,000 years ago. Guys, that is a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. Our minds are calibrated for the world exactly as it existed back then, not as it exists right now.
Think about it. Our ancestors lived in small hunter-gatherer bands. They had highly cohesive cultures, stable identities, and leadership was often informal and egalitarian. You knew literally everyone in your tribe. Now contrast that with modern society. Today, so many of us work in large, anonymous, bureaucratic structures with very rigid formal hierarchies. The psychologist Mark Van Vogt argues that this creates a massive psychological mismatch. Our minds still respond best to personalized, charismatic leadership in informal settings. It impartially explains why so many modern workers experience profound alienation and dissatisfaction in corporate environments. We simply aren't evolved to be anonymous cogs in a giant bureaucratic machine.
Section 5. Survival, Mating, and Language. Let's look at how this ancient hardware dictates our modern actions across these three specific domains.
When it comes to survival and cognition, we rely heavily on mental shortcuts, or heuristics. But man, can they glitch today. A really great example is the gambler's fallacy. If you flip a coin and get heads 9 times in a row, a lot of people feel deep down that the 10th flip just has to be tails, right? We falsely see patterns in random events. But why? Because our cognitive heuristics were designed for small tribes living out in nature, where truly random, independent events were incredibly rare. Our brains are hardwired to find patterns in order to survive, and that makes navigating casinos, a place built entirely on random chance, a very, very dangerous game for a Stone Age mind.
Next up, let's look at language. Evolutionary linguists like Steven Pinker build on Noam Chomsky's work to argue that language is actually a distinct psychological adaptation. Virtually every human on Earth acquires language completely organically between the ages of 1 and 4. We don't sit toddlers down with grammar textbooks, they just absorb it. It develops much like a physical organ would. And this is linked, in part, to a unique human allele of the FOXP2 gene, which emerged roughly 100 to 200,000 years ago. So language isn't just culture, it is deeply, deeply biological. Finally, let's turn to mating, which is heavily governed by evolutionary biology. To understand mating strategies objectively, we really have to look at anisogamy, which is the biological difference in reproductive cells between the sexes. Males produce small gametes, or sperm, at a relatively low initial physiological cost. Females, on the other hand, produce large gametes, or ova. But beyond just that, female biological investment includes gestation, childbirth, and lactation. So the initial physiological cost and time investment for a female to reproduce is just massively higher than it is for a male. And this biological reality brings us right to Robert Triver's parental investment theory. Trivers proposed that this fundamental disparity in biological costs leads to sexually dimorphic, meaning distinct male and female, adaptations in mating strategies. Strictly from a biological and evolutionary standpoint, the sex that invests less physically, which is generally males and mammals, will compete more aggressively for access to the higher investing sex. Meanwhile, the higher investing sex, females, tends to be much more selective in their mate choice, simply because the evolutionary cost of a poor genetic match is so much steeper for them. This framework impartially explains a lot of the psychological conflicts and strategies we observe between the sexes across human cultures. Which brings us to a pretty massive question I want to leave you pondering today. Can our ancient Pleistocene minds successfully adapt to the accelerating pace of modern cultural evolution? We are currently navigating a world of artificial intelligence, globalized anonymous networks, and endless supernormal stimuli, all while running on software designed for small hunter-gatherer bands 12,000 years ago. Now, understanding evolutionary psychology doesn't mean we are somehow bound by our biology. but absolutely gives us the blueprint of our own minds. It allows us to see why we do the things we do. So keep questioning the ancient hardware running in your own head.